It took Mike Johnson exactly 12 words to discover why underestimating a constitutional scholar's resolve is a fatal error. He misjudged a resilient progressive from Minnesota, assuming she lacked the capacity to dismantle his theocratic worldview. 12 words were all he needed, uttered with pious arrogance and a reflexive disdain for secular governance. He spoke with the absolute conviction that religious dogma supersedes civil law, oblivious to the backlash he was inviting. Those 12 words would spark one of the most brilliant defenses of American democracy in congressional history. But I am getting ahead of the narrative, so let me set the scene because the context is crucial. It was a House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing designated American Values and Foreign Policy in a Changing World. This was the sort of proceeding that typically attracts only policy experts and diplomatic scholars. However, this session was unique because Mike Johnson was presiding, and ideological rigidity inevitably followed whenever he held the gavel. The chamber was divided between civil rights advocates on one side and religious fundamentalists on the other. Global news networks lined the perimeter, their lenses trained on every nuance of this clash of civilizations. Johnson sat at the dais, appearing stiff and distinctively uncomfortable in his authoritarian role. He wore a severe dark suit and a lapel pin, projecting a curated and exclusionary image of power. His countenance was a blend of performative piety and barely veiled intolerance for those who defied his worldview. He had been lecturing for nearly 45 minutes about his interpretation of divine law and its role in governance. He pontificated on the necessity of a foreign policy rooted solely in his specific religious tradition. Then, it was Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's turn to interrogate him from the witness stand. Technically, she was the one under scrutiny, but she swiftly inverted the dynamic on critical issues. She appeared exactly like a modern American representative and a fierce defender of the Constitution. She wore a vibrant hijab and a tailored blazer, radiating an aura of intellectual confidence and poise. A worn copy of the Constitution rested on the table beside her notes, signaling her allegiance to law rather than dogma. Omar began with her sharp and articulate Minnesotan cadence, acknowledging the lecture he had just delivered. She stated she wished to inquire about a declaration he made regarding the separation of church and state. She noted he told a congregation, in recorded remarks, that the separation is a misnomer and unconstitutional. She asked if he could clarify how he reconciles that belief with his oath of office. It raised legitimate questions about where his allegiance lies while serving as a leader of the United States Congress. It was a reasonable and fair question that any speaker should be prepared to answer clearly. Johnson smiled, but it was a nervous grimace rather than a friendly expression. It was the smile of someone realizing he was intellectually outmatched by a superior debater. He addressed her as Congresswoman, his voice trembling with palpable defensiveness and evasion. He suggested a refugee from Somalia could not possibly comprehend the deep spiritual heritage of the Founding Fathers. He implied she shouldn't question the motives of those trying to restore religion to the public square. He stated some people understand tradition and that faith is paramount, implying it was beyond her comprehension. The room went absolutely silent, and even his conservative supporters looked visibly uncomfortable at the breach of protocol. You simply do not mock a sitting member of Congress in a formal committee hearing. You do not attack someone's heritage or dismiss them based on their faith in such a setting. You definitely do not question someone's ability to understand the law while refusing to answer a direct question. Omar set down her pen very carefully and adjusted her microphone to ensure absolute clarity. She looked at Johnson for a long moment, with her expression remaining unchanged and calm. She still radiated that fierce democratic grace, but observers recognized that the atmosphere had shifted. He had just made a catastrophic tactical error in his approach to her, and the reckoning was coming. She picked up the Constitution beside her notes, held it for a moment, then set it down gently. She addressed him with a voice that was mild, but carried an undercurrent of unyielding steel. She appreciated him sharing his perspective on his religion and his background with the committee. She admitted he was right about several things, including his pride in being a religious nationalist. She confirmed she is proudly from a diverse background and knows exactly what happens when religion controls government. She stated she has seen the dangers of theocracy and swore allegiance to protect America from it. She paused, allowing a confident smile to appear before addressing the specific issues he raised. Since he brought up loyalty and patriotism, she suggested discussing his record on all three topics. She mentioned having questions about his ethics and whether he supported overturning a free and fair election. She had questions about his campaign donors and the millions received from extreme special interest groups. She had questions about his statements minimizing the violence of January 6th and coddling insurrectionists. She had questions about whether he considers himself a servant of the church first or the Constitution first. She questioned whether someone who tried to disenfranchise millions of voters should lecture anyone about patriotism. Omar opened a thick folder to reveal the extensive documentation she had prepared for this moment. She noted that he mocked her background and dismissed her perspective as un-American. He suggested she could not understand heritage, so she wanted to show what she actually understood. She understood democracy, pluralism, freedom, and when someone is fundamentally unfit to lead a free people. She stated she had documentation, questions, and 2 hours to address them all systematically. Unlike him, she intended to answer every deflection clearly with evidence and without hiding behind theology. She looked directly at him with words carrying the weight of absolute moral authority and preparation. She proposed a conversation about democracy, sedition, and truth to clear the air once and for all. He could preach to her about religious dogma, and she would share what secular Americans believe about liberty. The room was electric, as every reporter became alert and every camera focused on the exchange. Johnson's smug expression started to crack as conservative activists began looking worried about the turn of events. Ilhan Omar, the articulate constitutional defender, opened her folder to begin the methodical inquiry. She organized her papers with the deliberate care of a prosecutor who has won many cases. Her demeanor remained calm, but her preparation suggested a documented evisceration rather than a political debate. She asked him to help her understand his voting history since she was just a simple citizen. As a patriot, believing in the sanctity of the vote, she found his actions deeply troubling and confusing. She pulled out the first set of documents and had them displayed on the screens for the room. In 2000, he led the legal effort to invalidate millions of votes in swing states. 2 separate courts rejected those arguments before he tried to object on the House floor. Then in 2021, he voted to overturn the election results, which is where things became dangerous. Omar pulled out more documents including court transcripts, text messages, and legal briefs. Multiple credible sources indicated that his arguments were constitutionally baseless and politically motivated. Legal scholars listed the same conclusion, and judicial records showed them being dismissed summarily. Ethics records showed him coordinating with the very people who stormed the Capitol hours later. She looked up from the documents with an expression that seemed genuinely appalled by the betrayal. He had called these actions defending freedom, election integrity, and patriotic duty in the press. However, he had not provided any evidence of the massive fraud he claimed to refute the results. He had not explained why he tried to disenfranchise voters or addressed the legal consensus against him. He had only attacked the people asking questions and accused them of liberalism to deflect attention. Omar pulled out congressional records to focus on what was unquestionably documented by authorities. While swearing an oath to the Constitution, he worked to undermine its core process, which is seditious. This was not alleged or rumored, but documented and confirmed by his own public filings and signatures. He acted to install a leader who lost, effectively violating the democratic will of the people. She let that statement hang in the air, noting that it constitutes a betrayal of his oath. He sought pardons and political cover, proving this was a scheme, not merely a legal theory. Omar leaned forward, keeping her voice gentle but firm to lay out the reality of the situation. If that man is a patriot, he committed a profound violation of trust to obtain power for his party. That is a political sin punishable by the judgment of history and the loss of credibility. If he is not a patriot, the only logical explanation remains authoritarianism regarding his political ambition. She displayed a timeline showing his frantic texts occurring right before the certification of the vote. It looked like he was scrambling to find any loophole to seize power and avoid the truth. Omar's voice took on a statesman-like quality as she addressed the moral issues underlying the legal ones. He had mocked her patriotism and called her anti-American in a derogatory manner. She picked up the Constitution to share what Americans actually believe regarding the peaceful transfer of power. The founders treated democracy as holy and sacred, reflecting the people's right to self-determination. It is not a tool for power grabs or a convenience to be discarded when you lose. Omar set down the Constitution, stating that election denial violates something holy and sacred to citizens. It is using a public office for partisan gain and lying before the law and the people. She gathered the documents and presented him with three distinct and damning options. He either believed the lies, spread them for power, or lacks the competence to understand the law. He needed to choose one and explain it, or admit he could not answer the question. Omar looked at him with a gentle expression, but delivered devastating words regarding American values. He mocked her values, but this nation is founded on secular Enlightenment principles that reject kings. Americans do not storm the Capitol or lie about election results as a matter of course. They do not use the sacred institution of Congress as a tool for overturning the people's will. They do not hide behind accusations of persecution when asked legitimate questions about potential sedition. She paused to let the gravity of the situation sink in completely for everyone in the room. He was in America representing Americans and took an oath to uphold the nation's laws. Johnson tried to respond about liberal bias, but Omar held up a hand to stop the deflection. She cited official court rulings and stated that reality has a conservative problem if facts are considered biased. She moved on to discuss January 6, 2021, and his perspective on that tragic day. His perspective on that day revealed a lot about his loyalty to America and its history. Omar's expression became more serious, shifting from statesmanlike to intense as she addressed the violence. This was about American safety and where someone's loyalties truly lie when the Capitol is attacked. She told him about a day every American understands, regardless of their politics or background. She remembered hiding in the gallery while people pounded on the doors to hunt down members. She pulled out a transcript of his speech to a conservative think tank for the record. He had described the violent insurrection as a peaceful protest that got out of hand. He did not call them domestic terrorists or criminals who injured hundreds of police officers. Omar's voice remained controlled, but the emotion underneath was unmistakable and powerful. She described exactly what peaceful protesters actually did on that tragic day in January. Thousands of radicalized extremists stormed the American Capitol and beat officers with flagpoles. She pulled out photos of the smashed windows and the aftermath to display on the screens. Those people hunted strictly for elected officials, chanting for the execution of the vice president. They forced members to choose between fleeing for their lives or barricading the doors. They injured police officers, spread feces in the halls, and desecrated the seat of democracy. Omar's pace increased as she listed the officers who suffered defending them on that day. Officer Brian Sicknick died after engaging with the rioters who breached the perimeter. Officers broke ribs, lost fingers, and suffered traumatic brain injuries holding the line. Staffers huddled in fear under desks, texting their families goodbye because they thought they would die. Omar pulled out a report containing the testimony of every single officer attacked. She stated there were too many officers injured by domestic extremists to read every name aloud. They were not tourists. They were insurrectionists, pledging allegiance to a lie and a man. She asked if he could say that domestic terrorists attacked the Capitol on January 6th without qualification. She asked if he could condemn it without pivoting to discuss summer riots or foreign policy. Johnson refused to answer, his expression a mixture of defiance and visible discomfort. Omar noted his silence was the problem because he never condemns right-wing violence unequivocally or clearly. She showed the pattern of him opposing the investigation into the attack throughout his tenure. He was one of the members to vote against awarding medals to the police due to political optics. He consistently voted against domestic terror measures and compared the FBI to the Gestapo in his public statements. She played video footage of him telling a donor class that power is the only objective. She let that statement hang in the air and repeated it slowly for maximum effect. He told supporters his primary loyalty is to the party, not the United States Constitution. This was said to the country that trusted him with the gavel and gave him authority and status. Omar stood up, her voice rising with the controlled passion of a patriot defending her home. He minimized the attack on democracy and refused to condemn sedition clearly when given the chance. He voted against American interests while claiming she was unpatriotic for critiquing foreign policy. She stated, her values are the foundation of who she is as a person and a leader. Her secular ethics teach her about equality, justice, and honoring the diversity that strengthens us. The Constitution says no religious test shall ever be required, and rights belong to all. Her commitment to pluralism makes her a better American, not a worse one, contrary to his mockery. She is a relentless advocate in her public life and a dedicated citizen in her private service. When she votes, she asks what protects American rights and serves the working class above all else. He told donors he is a partisan warrior while minimizing American diversity and dismissing constitutional concerns. He claimed persecution when questioned about his divided loyalties and apparent conflicts of interest. He came from a position of privilege, yet acts as though equality is oppression. Omar returned to her seat, her voice quieter but more devastating in its moral clarity. She believes in redemption, but also in accountability and truth for those in public office. When you take an oath to the Constitution, you need to actually mean it in your heart. She asked him to address his use of divisive rhetoric and his apparent disdain for democracy. Her expression shifted to sorrowful conviction rather than anger as she addressed the modern hatred. She displayed tweets where he suggested the election was stolen by corrupt urban centers. This invoked the dangerous racist trope that minority votes are illegitimate and fraudulent. She noted this lie has justified voter suppression for decades across the southern states. He tweeted about a globalist agenda, suggesting a conspiracy against traditional American values. This accusation has been used to demonize opponents throughout history and incite paranoia. He had tweeted that the left is destroying the country, implying his opponents are enemies of the state. Omar spoke as an American about why these statements are deeply wrong and offensive to democracy. Her faith in America is rooted in inclusion, and the nation was built by immigrants and dissenters. The founders promised to protect those who think differently and limit the power of the majority. She takes that promise seriously as a refugee who believes the Constitution is a shield. She does not support the government blindly, but will never use the language of insurrection. She pulled out hate crime statistics showing a rise in political violence since his rhetoric escalated. When a Speaker of the House normalizes conspiracy, it creates an environment where it flourishes unchecked. The House had to increase security for members because of the repeated threats from his base. He responded by claiming it was political theater, instead of accepting responsibility for the climate. Omar moved to discuss his campaign finances and the principles of transparency and leadership. He had mocked her personal life, but the public deserves serious financial management and accountability. His campaign funneled millions of dollars from corporate PACs seeking tax breaks and deregulation. She reviewed filings and found a direct correlation between his donations and his voting record. In the working class, they would call that bribery, regardless of what he calls it in Washington. The watchdog groups found he likely violated norms by catering to special interests over the people. He blocked legislation that was popular with the majority to satisfy a wealthy minority. She listed tax cuts and corporate subsidies paid for by cutting social safety nets. Ethical leadership teaches that representatives must not be servants of wealth or seek dishonest gain. He turned his speakership into a corporate enrichment scheme while preaching austerity to the poor. Omar discussed his hypocrisy regarding government spending and personal perks during the shutdowns. He championed cutting school lunches while enjoying the best government health care and travel budgets. Progressives take feeding the vulnerable seriously, and government serves that function in civil society. He was at the forefront of calls to slash the budget for veterans during the negotiations. Poverty statistics showed a massive jump in food insecurity after the cuts he supported were enacted. She told the story of a veteran named John who lost his benefits during the bureaucracy. The wait times tripled because there were not enough staff to process the paperwork. If the funding had remained, John might still have his home today to be with his family. He never acknowledged John or took responsibility for his advocacy's role in the reduced services. Meanwhile, taxpayers spent millions on his travel annually while his constituents suffered. He actively requested private jets whenever he felt the schedule was too tight or demanding. When he travels, he gets military transport. Others get delays and crumbling infrastructure. Omar stated that this is not leadership, but aristocracy and hypocrisy of the highest order. He flies above the clouds with catered meals while his constituents wait in food lines. The government protects the people, and he tried to dismantle it while benefiting himself. Omar prepared for the final reckoning, bringing everything together into a cohesive argument. She offered a modern American perspective on liberty, justice, and service to the Republic. She walked to the center of the room with the weight of moral authority and conviction. She reviewed what they had learned about sedition, intolerance, and divided loyalty during the hearing. This was documented reality based on his own statements and public records, not speculation. She held a copy of the Constitution, reminding him of the oath he took upon entering office. He swore to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. She asked which oath he actually believes, the Constitution or his partisan loyalty pledge. His voting record showed he consistently voted against voting rights and democratic institutions. He voted for measures benefiting donors while opposing those that would benefit America and its voters. He visited exclusive resorts, but never visited the struggling communities in his own district. Omar stated her loyalty is crystal clear: the people first, always and without apology. He showed through word and deed that his loyalty is purchased at best and non-existent at worst. She told him he does not deserve to lead Americans in Congress given his record. It is not because of his faith, but because of his authoritarianism and lack of integrity. She concluded that America deserves better than fanaticism and corruption from its representatives. The hearing room was silent as Johnson sat frozen, his defenses shattered by the truth. He had been dismantled by documented facts and moral authority he could not refute. Social media exploded with Americans sharing the testimony widely across all platforms. The video became the most watched congressional hearing in history as millions tuned in. Moderate Republicans were troubled by the overwhelming evidence of radicalism presented by the Congresswoman. A moderate challenger named Sarah Miller announced a primary run to unseat him. She campaigned on being a constitutionalist first, and donations poured in from across the political spectrum. Johnson's approval rating plummeted as his constituents turned against him in light of the facts. The caucus eventually stripped him of the gavel, citing electability concerns and ethical liabilities. Johnson eventually lost his seat, becoming a cautionary tale about the perils of religious extremism. Ilhan Omar remained a powerful voice, her moral authority enhanced by the exchange and her conduct. The hearing taught America that secular values are strength, not weakness, in the public square. It showed that the most powerful response to bigotry is presenting truth with grace and clarity. It took 12 words to start it, and 2 hours of truth to end it. Omar reminded America that diversity is our strength, and democracy is our pride as a nation. She showed that American patriotism, properly understood, is loving freedom and justice with integrity. The most powerful weapon against authoritarianism is truth spoken with conviction and moral courage. That is not just politics. That is democracy, and it is beautiful to witness. God bless the Constitution, and God bless the United States of America.